The preliminary report for Air India 171 came out a few days ago, and even though it revealed some disturbing details about the fuel control switches, there was a lot more to that report, and we still don't have the answers to some of the most important questions about this terrible tragedy. That's why I'm going to walk through the report and clear up some of the rumors and the speculation that's still out there. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. In order to understand what happened, first we need to talk about the pilots flying the plane and the aircraft they were flying. The initial reports said that the captain had over 8,000 hours of flight time, but the truth is he had over 15,000 hours of total flight time, and the 8,000 hours they were referring to was what he had on the Boeing 787. The report also confirmed that the first officer sitting next to him was the pilot flying the aircraft at the time of the crash, which is something that we're going to talk more about later. And he had over 3,400 hours of total flight time with over 1,100 hours on the Boeing 787. However, so far there hasn't been any further information released regarding the pilots. And even though there's a lot of rumors circulating right now about them, I just want to remind everyone that these are real people, and I can't imagine what their families and friends are going through right now trying to understand what really happened during the final moments of the flight. That being said, the preliminary report said that the aircraft they were flying had a few deferred maintenance items, but nothing that would have impacted the safety of the flight or played a role in the crash. However, what a lot of people have been focusing on is the fact that the report made reference to a special airworthiness bulletin issued by the FAA back in December of 2018 regarding the potential disengagement of the fuel control switch locking feature. But the thing you need to keep in mind is that this airworthiness bulletin was only issued because of something that was going on with the Boeing 737 and some instances where operators were reporting that the fuel control switches were installed with the locking feature disengaged. Basically, the fuel control switches have a locking feature that requires the pilot to lift up the switch to move it from the run to the cutoff position, which would prevent you from accidentally bumping the switch during flight and potentially shutting down the engines. And even though the FAA recommended that all the switches get checked on all Boeing aircraft, that check wasn't mandatory, and there weren't any recommendations for Boeing 787 operators to replace the switches. And even though it's true that Air India didn't inspect their 787s, there hasn't been a single report, as far as I know, of these switches being a problem in any other Boeing 787 over the last 7 years. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't some sort of mechanical fault or other issue that contributed to the crash. I'm just pointing out that it's highly unlikely based on the facts that the investigation has revealed so far. But now that we've talked about the pilots and the plane, we need to talk about some of the rumors versus the facts that are included in the report. On the day of the crash, the weather was clear skies with 6,000 meters of visibility and the temperature was 37 degrees Celsius or about 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, because that's pretty warm, there was a lot of speculation that density altitude was a factor in the crash, especially because there were reports that the pilots needed the entire runway for the takeoff. However, that's not what happened, and that's why I went to great lengths in my previous video to disprove that theory. Unfortunately, the preliminary report didn't provide the exact takeoff distance, but the takeoff was normal, and this photo taken from a CCTV camera showed that the aircraft was airborne before the end of the runway, so hopefully that clears that up. Now, the other thing I want to talk about when it comes to the weather is the rain. When I made my last video about this tragedy, I had a few people that emailed me that were very upset because they said the reason the plane crashed was essentially due to an electrical fault that caused the engines to roll back to sub-idle as soon as they got airborne. And someone even shared with me this leaked insider report that explained how torrential rain during the pushback resulted in moisture intrusion that caused all of this. The only problem was that the entire leaked insider report was 100% AI generated and essentially a big scam, as I explained on another video that I did on Patreon. In fact, the truth is that there wasn't any rain on the day of the crash, and there hadn't been any rain in the previous 48 hours, but this is what happens when everyone wants answers and the people doing the investigation choose to remain silent instead of holding periodic press conferences to share the facts as they become available. That being said, the next thing I want to talk about from the report is the flaps. Because if you remember, within 24 hours of this terrible tragedy, there was a theory that the pilots accidentally raised the flaps instead of the landing gear, and that's what caused them to crash. Unfortunately, several news outlets took that theory and ran with it as the most likely cause of the crash, throwing the pilots under the bus without any proof whatsoever. But the thing is, that theory was essentially ruled out within another 24 hours. In fact, the preliminary report confirmed that the flap handle was in the 5-degree flap position, which was consistent with a normal takeoff flap setting. You also need to know that the thrust levers were found in the idle position in the wreckage, but the flight data showed that they were in the takeoff thrust position all the way until impact, so that means the pilots never moved the thrust levers during the flight, and the impact itself was what moved them to the idle position. Additionally, the landing gear lever was found in the down position, but the report didn't really provide any further details about that. You see, during takeoff, as soon as you rotate the aircraft and have a positive rate of climb away from the ground, the pilot monitoring will say positive rate, and then the pilot flying will call for the gear to be raised. But none of that is mentioned in the report, so it's not clear if they were about to raise the landing gear and they stopped, or perhaps they lost thrust so quickly that the captain never said positive rate. We just don't know. But what we do know is the timeline of what happened during the takeoff, and that's what we're going to talk about next. According to the report, the pilots were cleared for takeoff at 8:07:33, and then 4 seconds later, they began the takeoff roll. Now in this case, because the first officer was the pilot flying, typically what happens is he's going to push the throttles forward to the takeoff power setting, and then his left hand should move up to the yoke, and the captain will place his right hand on the throttles. That's because the captain owns the abort procedure if they need to abort prior to V1. Remember, the aircraft is heavyweight and it's hot outside, so it took 56 seconds for them to accelerate down the runway before they reached V1. When they hit that speed, the aircraft should give them an automated call out saying V1, and then the captain will remove his hand from the throttles because at that point you're committed to going flying. And that means no one should have their hand anywhere near the throttles, which is kind of important to what happened next. That's because 2 seconds after they reached V1, they were at rotation speed, and the captain would typically say rotate, and then the first officer pulled back on the controls to rotate the aircraft away from the ground. 4 seconds after that, the aircraft air-ground sensors transitioned to air mode, reflecting that the aircraft was airborne. This is when the captain would normally call out positive rate, like I mentioned earlier, but the report didn't talk about this. Instead, all it says is that 3 seconds after they got airborne, the aircraft reached 180 knots, which was the maximum speed recorded. Immediately thereafter, the Engine 1 and Engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff position one after another with a time gap of 1 second. That's probably the most consequential line in this entire report, and there's a few things that you need to know about this. First of all, after rotation, the first officer's hand was the only one that should have been moving back to the throttles because he's the pilot flying, but we don't know if that ever happened. More importantly though, I'd argue that because it says the switches transition one after another, to me that means it's highly unlikely the switch movement was accidental, because the locking mechanisms on those switches should prevent that. But also, if this was accidental, it likely would happen at the same time, but instead the report said there was a 1 second gap, which is about the time it takes for your hand to move from one switch to the other. However, the report never says who moved the switches or why. Regardless, it all happened very quickly because 4 seconds after they reached 180 knots, the RAT began providing hydraulic power. We can also see the RAT deployed immediately after they got airborne. Once again, this photo was another detail that the authorities could have revealed to the public much sooner instead of leaving everyone to speculate. Either way, as soon as the fuel switches moved to the cutoff position, the engine power began decreasing, and one of the pilots was heard asking the other, "Why did he cut off?" And the other responded, "He did not do so." Now, my guess is they didn't specify which pilot said what, because they're either not sure or they know the answer and they don't want to reveal it until the investigation is over. And honestly, whoever moved the switches could have asked the other pilot if they did it, simply because they knew the CVR was recording everything and they wanted to make it seem like the other pilot was the one that moved the switches. All right, back to the timeline. 5 seconds after the RAT deployed, the Engine 1 switch moved from the cutoff to the run position, and 2 seconds later, the APU door opened as the APU began to start, and 2 seconds after that, the Engine 2 switch moved from the cutoff to the run position. That means it took about 10 to 14 seconds from the time the fuel switches moved to the cutoff position to the time they moved back to the run position. Now, in my opinion, that timing makes sense because if you lose thrust on both engines on takeoff, it's going to be a complete shock to you, and it's going to take a few seconds to analyze the situation and figure out what's going on, as you've probably got all kinds of alarm bells and warnings going off at the same time, so I think that explains the delay in the switch movement. About 9 seconds later, one of the pilots transmitted "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," but the report doesn't say who made the call, even though the news said it was the captain that did it. There's also no mention of the captain saying "thrust not achieved," falling, which was also reported in the news, so it's pretty frustrating that we still don't have any clarity on this, and it makes me wonder what else was said in the cockpit that the report chose to leave out. 6 seconds after the Mayday call, the aircraft data stopped when they crashed. And despite the fact that the report did provide clarity about a few different things, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. Unfortunately, given the lack of transparency so far, I think we're likely going to have to wait another year or possibly longer before we get a final report. In the meantime, the internet, I'm sure, is going to fill the void with rumors and more speculation. However, hopefully this debrief has been helpful, and I can promise you that once that final report is published, I'll give a full debrief and the truth about what caused this terrible tragedy. In the meantime, thanks for watching and thanks for your support.